Hi, I'm Zach Waters, and welcome to another episode of WTF-STOP Photo Talk, where I chat to photographers about their life and connection to the world through photography. British documentary photographer Nick Hedges was born in 1943 in Bromsgrove, Worcestershire. He is renowned for his extensive work highlighting social issues, particularly housing conditions in the UK. Hedges pursued photography at Birmingham College of Art in 1965 to 1968. His final academic project involved collaboration with Birmingham Housing Trust, which focused on the city's substandard housing, which laid groundwork for his future endeavours. Upon graduating, Hedges joined Shelter, serving as a photographer and researcher from 1968 to 72. During this period, he documented living conditions in cities such as Glasgow, Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Bradford and London, aiming to shed light on the housing crisis affecting millions in Britain at the time. His photographs were instrumental in raising public awareness about these issues. After his tenure with Shelter, Hedges worked as a freelance documentary photographer from 1972 to 1980, collaborating with organisations including Mencap, Population Countdown, the BBC, Penguin Books and New Society. In 1976, he was commissioned by the Royal Town Planning Institute to create the exhibition Problem in the City. That same year, he received an Arts Council fellowship to document working lives in factories and steelworks in the West Midlands, culminating in the publication of the book Born to Work by Pluto Press in 1982. Between 1976 and 1980, Hedges undertook the I'm a Believer project, photographing various religious communities in Wolverhampton. In 1979, he was commissioned by the Side Gallery in Newcastle to document the fishing industry around the North Shields fish quay. From 1980 to 2003, Hedges served as the head of photography at West Midlands College of Higher Education and later at the University of Wolverhampton. In 2004, Hedges donated his entire collection of Shelter negatives, contact sheets and prints to the Library of Birmingham. A selection of this work was exhibited in Making Life Worth Living at the Science Museum in London between 2014 and 2015. Hedges has published several books compiling his photographic work, including In the Shadows in 2012, which presents significant images from his time with Shelter, and his book entitled Home was published by Pluto Press in 2021. His work continues to be recognised for its contribution to documenting social conditions and advocating for change through visual storytelling. My chat with Nick was a long time coming, and I really wanted to find out how he had connected to the world through his photography throughout his career. We discussed in particular the difference between how he shoots black and white to colour.
And it allows you to concentrate the spectator's eye, the audience's eye, on essential psychological and human feelings. What colour does.
I was really keen to find out how he integrated with the people in the communities in places like Glasgow.
If I was on my own, there was an advantage in appearing as I did, which was rather, a bearded, long-haired, eyeglasses, scruffy-looking individual didn't pose any threat at all to people. I was a curiosity in a sense.
And we also discussed how he wants to be remembered.
Good provision for my children and grandchildren to try and ensure that my work gets seen and recognised and valued for what it was, and simply to have enough money to live on. That's all I need.
So the day came for our chat, and I asked him what he was up to.
I retired from lecturing, back in 2003 for health reasons. I'd had a quadruple heart bypass, and I've been a type 1 diabetic since I was 20. My health was a bit on the edge. So since that time, I've digitised all my film archive, negative archive that is, and have been working on the production of books, initially self-published through Blurb and latterly being produced by Colin Wilkinson at Pluto Press.
Yeah, that was Holman Street, wasn't it, with Pluto Press?
That's right. And we've got another one coming out later this year called Work.
Do you find you're looking back at your archive now and sort of reinventing some of it as well in terms of the presentation of it, because I notice in your blurb books you have In the Shadows, Antidote to Enoch. You have all these titles which seems to sort of be reinventing some of the narratives you shot in the past.
I think the thing about being a documentary photographer is that and if you live as long as I have, your photographs start to take on a different meaning, in as much as when you initially take them, they have a reason and a purpose, and that reason and purpose changes in time, and instead they become historical documents. And you've got the advantage of history to look back and see how those fit into the context of where society was at those times. So the Antidote to Enoch one, for instance, is a book about an exhibition I did for the Wolverhampton Interfaith Group, which looked at every different religion in Wolverhampton. It had a particular purpose at the time, but since then, of course, it's been particularly relevant. And at the time, Enoch Powell had just stopped being the MP for Wolverhampton, and his notorious speech, it still rang in the ears and minds of the people of the good city, and we were trying to do something to change it, change people's attitudes towards the new migrant communities in the town. So these days, those pictures assume a different context because it's 50 years on, and the status and importance of migrant communities has become much more firmly established, strongly established.
Yeah.
And it's possible to see it in a different way and use them in a different way,
Yeah. You've also had a long association with Shelter, the housing charity. You donated all your shelter work to the Birmingham Library a few years ago, didn't you?
That's right. Quite soon after my big heart operation, I decided that it was important that the work I'd done with Shelter remained in the public domain. When you have an operation like that, your mortality is suddenly thrust in your face. So I decided I had very good contacts with Peter James, who was the curator of photography at the new library in Birmingham. He had one of the very biggest collections of photography in the country, and I thought it was an appropriate place to put that archive. And I gave it to them, contact sheets, negatives, any printed material I'd still got, and a set of books as well. And it's remained there ever since. The library ran out of money, and although they do use it, and it has been used by television companies, it's going to be used for next year's Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. They're doing an exhibition there. So it's just still being used, but it's not being used in quite as vital a way as I would have liked.
I think that's time. I think something like that was going to be really interesting to look back at in 50, 60, 100 years.
I know that. Yeah, I mean they've got archives of Sir Benjamin Stone's glass plates, which were there with the library there, and they've used a lot of historical material. And over time, you're right, things will get used. Yeah.
Main focus over the last 50 years has been housing and working with the likes of Shelter. You really have focused on the working man. What were you looking for?
Well, I think the thing when you begin in photography, you start to realize that photography is a wonderfully democratic tool. Its invention freed art and painting to go in its own directions, modernism, whatever. Photography replaced it and allowed us to appear in a way that the middle classes and working classes had never done before. If you can imagine that back in 1850, 1860, that the only image that you ever saw was an image of the Queen or the King on the back of a coin or appearing on stamps, and that the only pictures that you ever saw were of the aristocracy, you can see how democratic photography is. It's created a worldwide community The problem we've got with photography is how to exercise more control over it so that it can represent a view of society which is not controlled by the wealthy and those in power. And that, I think, is one of the ongoing fights that photography has today as well.
Photography's taught you a lot about life. It's given you access to life, people's lives. It's given you a very raw insight into people's life. But I think also a very rich and rewarding insight into other people's lives as well.
I think the important thing is that photography is a passport. It allows you to explore different societies, new communities, and as long as you form the right relationship with those communities, and as long as you respect their identity and their status as human beings, because we are all exactly equal, then photography is that passport. You can, through your work, describe and talk about a range of experiences that are outside the range of experiences of most normal people's lives.
I'm intrigued to find out more about them life experiences. Nick, take me right back to the beginning. Where did it all start for you?
Well, I come from a middle class background. My mother studied textile design at art school before the Second World War. My father was employed by a timber firm purchasing home-grown timber in the Midlands in Worcestershire. I went to a primary school, passed my 11 plus, which on reflection probably wasn't a good idea because it meant they sent me to a school about 12 miles away from all my mates in primary school. Anyway, at school, I had very little opportunity to explore the visual arts. Literature was well taught, but I hadn't to choose between doing either Latin or art. And because they thought I might go to Oxford, they insisted I did Latin. So I didn't have any art education at all. Like a lot of teenagers, when you get to about 15 or 16, apart from the urges which start wanting you to explore the opposite sex, there are also creative urges. And a lot of people go into music. It's not surprising that so many young men and women take up music in their teens to explore creativity, to explore their own minds and their own feelings. And in my case, I was lucky. I had a relative who was keen on photography and he introduced me to it. So although at school I didn't have any opportunity to explore the visual arts, through my family connections, I started to learn about photography. One of the first influences was a wonderful magazine called Photography Magazine. It was edited by Norman Hall, who was the picture editor of the Times. It was a monthly and it came out usually at the beginning of the month, and always had at least one and possibly two documentary picture spreads of famous photographers, people like Brassai, Robert Doisneau, Cartier-Bresson, and so on. And so gradually I began to identify great photography as being of that type, rather than great photography being to do with still life or nudes or any kind of artistic pretense. It was more the social documentary that attracted my attention. That's where I started to develop my ambition to do photography as a career. When I finished school, I didn't get particularly good A-level grades, and I did one term at a teacher's training college, and I failed my blackboard writing test because I'm left-handed. So I left in disgust. No, I actually left because I knew I wouldn't become a teacher. I applied to the College of Art in Birmingham to do photography. And that's where I ended up, a year or two older than most of the other people, because I had this mishap with the teacher training college. I started doing photography in 1964 at the Birmingham School of Photography, part of the College of Art. When I got there, I discovered that their version of photography was mainly technical, industrial, commercial, and advertising. I thought, hold on, that's not what I wanted to do. And so I had to struggle to find the right influences and the right opportunities to explore the type of photography that I wanted to do. And gradually they came through. It was hard work. I had to learn how to mix chemicals, operate studio flash, work with 5.4 cameras. I've dispatched all that knowledge into the nether regions of my brain. I wouldn't know how to do it now. Anyway, I eventually found a tutor who was able to let me work on projects which were nearer my heart. One of the first ones I did was projects for a Spark book in Birmingham to illustrate a book which had been published, and they wanted illustrations, and they approached the local School of Art to do it. It was to do with race and relations in Sparkbrook in Birmingham. And so gradually, through the college course and through a very good friend of mine I shared a flat with, I learned how to work with 35mm cameras. Both of us shared an enthusiasm for rangefinder cameras, and we both also shared an enthusiasm for Tri-X as opposed to Ilford HP5. Anyway, that's another story. And we taught ourselves how to work in low light level conditions, to work with available light, not using flash, pushing the technique right to the edge. I'm going to stop there for a moment, if I may.
With your work, you wanted to use photography as a way to ask questions really early on, do you think?
I'm not sure. Well, I've always wanted to ask questions. It's not a surprise that when artists and photographers get asked about the secrets to their work, they often say it's to be curious, to remain curious. And I think that thing about being curious about life is absolutely fundamental. It's not to accept. It's always to wonder, well, why is that? Why did that happen? Why is that person in that situation? What happens when you do this? It's this constant questioning allows us to understand the meaning of life. You can't understand a meaning unless you ask the questions. The meaning just doesn't present itself to you. You've got to ask the right kind of questions to begin with.
Yeah, it's quite obvious when you were searching for meaning in your work. You wanted to do something which give you some understanding of what was in front of you.
That's true. But I think the other thing that people forget about the 1960s, and I'm talking now about, since I started college in 64 and I didn't finish until 68, and that period of time was revolutionary in more than one way. I mean, it was revolutionary in terms of what it's become famous for, the swinging 60s. So music, pop art, and whatever. But it was also very significant in terms of movements of social change, theories to do with renewing social policy. And those ideas came from the struggle for desegregation and racial equality in America, but also in France, they came from the battles that were in response really to post-colonialism. I mean, you have to remember that England and France had enormous numbers of colonies all over the world, and these were given their freedom and independence in the 1960s. And all of that there was a trade-off in terms of young people of my age in their early 20s, in terms of revisiting what was possible with life now. So the questions were really significant. You got Catholic philosophers like Ivan Illich, who was a priest in Central America, re-exploring what religion and Catholicism might do for poor communities. The idea of the barefoot doctor. You got the idea of using bicycles. I mean, feminism was just starting. I mean, there were all kinds of revolutionary ideas. It was a really exciting time to be a young person. I'm not suggesting it isn't now, but it was a very vital time.
Were you aware of the work of Walker Evans then and his work with the FSA?
Yeah. Ha! I'm glad you mentioned that, because I got thrown out of college in my second year because they decided they couldn't teach me any more of the kind of things I wanted to learn about. That was a shock to me. In fact, I went back and did my third year a year later. But in that intervening year, I happened to go into my local library and was looking for things to read. And I explored the art and photography section several times and had really sort of finished with that. Thought, well, where else shall I go? And I went to the sociology section, and what should I find on the sociology shelves but Walker Evans and James A.G.'s book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men? And I absolutely devoured it, and it became one of the most important books in my education. And it still is. I mean, I still read the introduction to it, and there are so many truths about our responsibility towards other humans, about how to live and work with other people, that it became very significant. And of course, Walker Evans' pictures were a huge influence on me, as were Dorothea Lange's from the FSA as well.
Is that why in your third year you went and did a social housing project, didn't you?
Well, in my third year, the local housing trust in Birmingham approached us, and approached the college, that is, and offered someone the opportunity to make an exhibition for them. And of course, I immediately volunteered for it because it was exactly the kind of thing I wanted to do. So I spent 3 or 4 months working on my final project, which was a depiction of bad housing and people living in poor housing in Birmingham. And it was later used as an exhibition by the Housing Trust. And luckily, for me, that is, the director of Shelter happened to be up in Birmingham because Shelter donated funds to the Housing Trust. And he saw my photographs. 2 or 3 weeks later, I got a phone call asking me about whether I'd like to come and work with Shelter in London. So, having signed on at the local labour exchange, I signed off again and went down to London.
After uni, you continued your focus on depravity, maybe, if that's a word, these areas like Glasgow, Manchester, and all these areas.
Working with Shelter had a policy which was every year to focus on a particular aspect of housing. And it might be the connection between bad housing and education, bad housing and health. And so they would choose different cities in Britain, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Newcastle, Sheffield, Leeds, Bradford, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, London, and so on. They would send me to go and photograph in those areas because they were exploring a particular aspect of housing, which might have been to do with, as I say, health or education. And then their researchers built up the connections between poor environments and health, bad housing and low attainment in education, and so on. And that's how I got to photograph in all those different cities.
What was your camera of choice then? What lenses were you using?
My camera of choice has always been a rangefinder camera. I used a Leica M2 and then a Leica M4 for a wide angle and standard lens, and an SLR for an 85 or a 90mm lens. That's perfect balance for me between enabling you to work with a wide angle lens, means you can work within what I consider psychological distance between you and your subject. You're within their range. You're not photographing from a distance. You're close up, often within sort of 4, 5, 6 foot, 1 meter to 1.5 meters. It allows you an intimate, or to start to form a more intimate relationship with them, with your subject matter. So I've always used Leicas and either a Canon or a Nikon with an 85mm lens on, which allowed me to make the background more blurred if necessary. one of the great things about photography, and it's a lesson that you can teach young people this, is that cameras, camera lenses see things out of focus. Our eyesight doesn't allow us to do that because our eyes focus so quickly from when you're looking close up to the distance. There is never any out of focus. Everything is always in focus. It's interesting to teach students. That's an advantage that you can exploit in photography, that out of focus is sometimes a good thing to use. Sorry to diverge on the technical side, but it just reminded me, I used to have this debate with people quite often about rangefinder cameras. The great thing about rangefinder cameras, of course, is they equate to the human eye more, in as much as you don't see things out of focus. You see things in focus all the time. And it allows you to make and shape photographs in the way that the human brain does, as opposed to a reflex camera where you have this disadvantage or advantage of seeing things in and out of focus.
What film were you using?
I used Trex, always did. And I used to push it slightly, dilute the developer 1:1. I used to use Kodak developer D76 1:1. So you use it once and throw it away, but it allowed you to build up detail in the shadows slightly without over-developing in the highlights. There's always a danger if you push film that you're going to get a reduced tonal range. So it was a small trick I learnt when I was a student.
You've stuck to black and white throughout your career, although colour does creep into your work, your Tanzania work. And there are a few colour images slotted in your galleries of your street photography and stuff like that. What's kept you on that path of black and white?
Effectively, it's to do with more to do with the commissioning process and what the people I worked with wanted. I mean, the majority of my work was taken between the mid-60s and, if you like, the early 1980s. And most of the people who wanted photographs then were working with black and white. And it was really after Paul Graham, Martin Parr, and others revolutionized the approach to color photography in the early 1980s that color completely took over. When I was lecturing in photography later on, I used to always insist that students should use color wherever possible. It didn't seem to be logical to use black and white anymore. If black and white photography hadn't been invented first, no one would have taken pictures in black and white. It would always been in color. So I think that it's quite natural to work in color now. And I haven't taken a black and white photograph since 1995. The last project I did in black and white was a project I did for my daughter's primary school in Shrewsbury because I wanted to give them a set of prints. Didn't have a color darkroom. So I knew that I would work in black and white because I could produce the stuff economically for them. But since 1995, everything I've shot is in color.
A lot of your early heroes, or even current heroes, were black and white photographers. Philip Jones Griffiths, Eugene Smith were very close to you in a sense of your inspiration.
Yeah, I think black and white photography allows you to do things quite differently. Seeing in color is very, very different. I tried to articulate this and found it difficult to explain, but what black and white does, it simplifies things and it allows you to concentrate the spectator's eye, the audience's eye, on essential psychological and human feelings. What color does is it swamps the audience with information. Whilst it, in one sense, is more realistic, it doesn't allow you to concentrate the mind in the same way that a black and white photograph does. I don't know if I explained that very well, but one of the difficulties, I think, that you see with the sort of plethora of images that appear on Instagram and all the phone photographs that are taken is that people have not really started to appreciate the language of photography. In the same way as we at primary school learn about language in terms of words and reading, writing, and spelling, there isn't the equivalent in terms of visual language. And I think that it's something that young photographers, particularly these days, should start to explore. How do you teach a visual language of photography? I throw that out as a challenge because I think it's absolutely significant. If you want to get great photographers in the future, they've got to learn how to work with the poetry of the medium more than they do at the moment.
I'm fascinated by your Glasgow slum pictures. Can you take me back there a little bit and talk about your experience, the feeling, and your time you spent in Glasgow?
I'd never been to Scotland. It was the first time I'd ever been. My first trip, I got the train from Euston, arrived at the main station in Glasgow. I knew I had an assignment which was to explore areas of the city like the Gorbals and Mary Hill. So I walked out of the station and thought, well, I better find somewhere to stay. Walked up the street. Almost the first thing I came across was a blind man with holding his white cane up in the air with a cap on the ground, and basically he was a beggar. I thought, oh, didn't experience that down in London. The next thing I saw was these two lads, aged about 6 or 7, running or skipping down the street towards him, and they made a quick assessment of the situation, realised he was blind, stooped down and snatched his cap with money in it and ran off with it. So these kids had robbed the blind man. I thought, Jesus, what an introduction to the city. The next moment I saw was they crossed the road and were running back up the street to work from the direction they'd come in. And they were arguing about who should have the dosh, so that thieves had fallen out. So that was my first introduction to the city. I was really shocked by the housing situation I found there. I can say that back in 69 or 70, when I first fled to Glasgow, I'd never seen a city which had got such dereliction, such a huge amount of really poor housing conditions. We found tenement blocks where there were just 1 or 2 families left. The rest of the block, and it might have previously housed 300 or 400 people. They were Victorian tenements, were empty. One woman said to me that she and her husband and baby were asleep, and suddenly they were woken by the sound of a wrecking ball. So her husband had to grab his clothes, run out, and demolition men had started to demolish the tenements without realizing there were people still living there. I mean, it was utter despair and chaos there. As I say, I've never seen housing conditions as bad, and they weren't as bad in cities like Liverpool or Manchester or Birmingham, London.
You can feel it. You can sense it. They're very claustrophobic, the images. I was shocked when I first saw them.
Yeah.
How did people accept you there? Were you with people from the organisation, which got you access into the places, or were you just wandering into places? How did that work?
It worked in 2 ways. I mean, sometimes I was with a researcher, sometimes I was on my own. If I was on my own, there was an advantage in appearing as I did, which was rather, a bearded, long-haired, eyeglasses, scruffy-looking individual didn't pose any threat at all to people. I was a curiosity in a sense. I remember, I talked to one of the children who appears in one of the pictures I met about 3 or 4 years ago, and she said to me, I won't try to do a Glaswegian accent, but she said to me, Nick, we'd never seen anyone look like you in our area before. You looked utterly bizarre. Meeting people and talking to them about housing, I didn't pose any kind of threat to them. I was definitely on their side, in inverted commas, as opposed to being an official. And I think that sense of being on their side is psychologically important, obviously. And I remember someone also this was in Liverpool, explaining to me that at one time Shelter were offered the services of a very famous and well-to-do advertising photographer. I wish I could remember his name. I can't, I'm afraid. Anyway, he turns up at this Liverpool terraced house to take photographs in a Rolls Royce with 2 assistants and a huge amount of electronic flash lighting. How on earth is that person going to be able to relate to the subject matter that he intends to photograph? And I think that without being cynical about it, you've just got to be ordinary. You're an ordinary person. You are exactly the same status as everyone else in the street. You shouldn't have any pretensions about yourself and your aura or your status.
Did places like Glasgow have an effect on you?
Well, I worked for Shelter for 4 years and stopped in the summer of 72. And the reason I stopped was because I started to recognize that my images were becoming repetitive. They didn't offer a fresh view. And I thought it was important to have someone else come in and look at the same problems, but in a new way.
Different perspective.
Yeah.
How were your pictures used then? Do you think your pictures were put to good use? Did they change anything there?
You know very well, Zach, that the housing situation in this country at the moment is terrible. So if you say, were my pictures put to good use, all I'll say is that at the time, Shelter were able to effect changes in legislation, changes in the law. They drew attention to the crisis that existed about the dreadful housing stock had existed since Victorian times. But the answers that were proposed in the 70s and 80s were the wrong answers. So people built tower blocks, and then Thatcher withdrew and sold off all social housing. So the crisis has repeated itself in a different form. It's an indicator, I think, that if you are involved in anything to do with wanting to affect social change, is that you always have to be on guard. Things are never permanent. Things go backwards as well as forwards, and you have to improve things. You've only got to look at the crisis that has existed with women's rights and the rights of black and brown people in this country. Black Lives Matters. We knew about those problems back in the 1960s. Some of us fought, in inverted commas, to do something about the situation of women, the situation of black people in this country. But we didn't do enough. We failed. And those crises have continued, and they need to be re-examined and re-explored now.
Out of all the photographs you've taken, which one do you sort of always go back to and think, yeah, I got it?
Oh my gosh.
Shall I tell you mine first?
Yeah, all right.
My favourite picture of yours is the Manchester shot with the travellers' caravans. And I always go back to that picture and look at it. I find it a wonderful picture of redevelopments.
Oh, yeah, I know that.
I don't know, it just sums up the time for me. And the way the caravans are parked and the landscape, the industrial landscape. And it's just a lovely coming together of lots of elements. It's my favourite picture of yours. And that's one image I like to look at it. What's yours?
That's interesting. I mean, I think one of the advantages of choosing a photograph which doesn't contain a human emotion, a human being, it's like a still life. It doesn't pull you about in the same way as an emotive photograph might. Gosh, one of my favourite photographs it's slightly sentimental. It's an image I took when I was still a student of Mr. Sarr, who's Nigerian. He'd just come in from work and he's lying down on his bed with his stepson, who's white, just having a game. And they're thoroughly engrossed in that. Dad's back from work. They're completely relaxed. And I knew the picture at the moment it happened. I thought, Oh my God, what a wonderful example of the fact that we are all the same. And what a wonderful example of fatherhood, etc., etc. And yet that family were living in dreadful housing conditions. That's the background to it. I knew that Mr. and Mrs. Saar and their two children had had to survive in terrible housing conditions. Luckily, we were able to rehouse them later on. That's my favourite photograph.
Has anybody come back to you in recent years asking you about the photographs you've taken of their grandparents, mothers?
Oh, yeah. That's the great thing about having a website and the internet, is that you get connected to people all the time. You get someone ringing you up or emailing you and saying, that image that you took back in 1971, I think that's me. They're now in their 50s. I had a wonderful contact with there's one image I've got, which is I took for the interfaith group in Wolverhampton, of an elderly Sikh and his grandson walking down some steps with the main Anglican church behind them. They'd just been feeding the birds. The grandson, wife, 45 years on, contacted me and said that she thought that was her husband. Would it be possible to have a photograph of it? So I supplied her with an image and I was delighted. And then she said, I was really amused about this. She said, have you got any other photographs which show his face better? He was only about 3 at the time. I had to go back to my contact sheets. And I actually found I got 3 or 4 other images, and they were absolutely thrilled. I was able to print them up and send them to them. And they've distributed them all round their family group. The other thing about that image is it also appears, there's a Times journalist and writer called Satnam Sanghera, who's just done a book called Empire Land, which is about the exploration of growing up as a young Indian boy in Wolverhampton. And he uses that image in his YouTube account of his YouTube account of that. So that recontacting people, reconnection with people is quite extraordinary.
You eventually moved into teaching.
Yeah.
You were a regular contributor to camera work. What about 10/8? What was your involvement with 10/8?
Oh, I was on the group editorial committee for that. Yeah.
And for those listening who have no idea what 10/8 is, now I have a few copies of 10/8. What was 10/8 about?
Camera Work was a magazine that came out from London, and it sponsored the kind of ideas about photography that I've been talking about. 10/8, the Midlands, West Midlands, in the 1980s was a bit of a void, really, when it came to photography. So 1 or 2 photographers decided that they should start to publish a magazine. People like John Reardon, Brian Homer, Derek Bishton, another one, John Taylor. They started this magazine, which ran for about 30 issues, got support from West Midlands Arts and then the Arts Council in London. And it was a sort of, it explored ideas to do with colonialisation, about LGBT issues, about alternative and radical theories, which started to develop in photography in the 80s and 90s.
It was a bit of a Bible, wasn't it, for some photographers?
It was.
As well as the magazines, you were teaching at university?
Well, the lecturing I did was, it was a peculiar arrangement. My wife and I decided that, because our family were very young, I ought to try and seek some kind of more regular employment. The idea was that I would teach full-time for 5 years until the kids were at secondary school. And then I'd go back to being a half-time photographer, half-time lecturer. But for domestic reasons, that never happened. So the lecturing went on for longer than I'd wanted. I think what happened then was my health deteriorated. I had to take early retirement. And the medal that you mentioned I was awarded was a surprise to me, because it seemed to me to come out of the blue. Like all medals and awards, they don't really count. The only thing that matters to me is this conversation that we're having at the moment. I'm grateful that you've allowed me to have this chat, because it allows my thoughts and ideas to be picked up by one or two people. I'm sorry, more than that, I'm sure. Prestige and status don't count at all. I've never understood why people pursue them.
What do you think people will take from your work? You took inspiration from Walker Evans, Eugene Smith, Philip Jones Griffiths. What are people going to take from your work, do you think?
To make good provision for my children and grandchildren, to try and ensure that my work gets seen and recognised and valued for what it was, and simply to have enough money to live on. That's all I need.
And your approach?
Yeah, I would hope it was more the approach. I would hope it was more to do with recognising that all of human society is interconnected, that we all have the same status. We should have the same status, the same value, and that we live by certain rules that society has built up over thousands of years. I would hope young photographers might pick up on is a recognition that those values are worth hanging on to, and to explore injustices, difficulties that have occurred for communities, but also recognise the positive nature of our relationship to each other, because that's the strength of our society, is that interrelationship, our closeness to each other, that kind of mutual respect and reliability. And I would hope that that's what they would take and learn from.
Who's influencing you now? Who you look at the work and you think, wow.
That's very difficult. Can I answer in a different way? I think one of the problems that there exists at the moment is that documentary photography has got locked into the art world, so that wrong values are attached to it, false values are attached to it. I make prints still, but I never sell them for more than 25 or 30 quid. Yet some documentary photographers who are still alive sell their prints for 1,000 quid or so. That's ridiculous, absolutely stupid, because you're creating a patronage for your work, which can only be afforded by rich people. And photography ought to be available to everyone. So that's the first part. The second part is the problem with that kind of visual democracy, where billions of photographs are taken, is that no one is able to see or create the right context to make significant work. And that's where teaching and learning and understanding of visual language is really, really important. And I'd say that probably the people, I don't know about them, but the people who are doing the most significant work at the moment are those people who are helping young people understand why photographs matter and what they can do.
Nick, it's been an education. I've really enjoyed listening to every word. Thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Jack, thank you ever so much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure listening to your life story and the man behind your work. I wish you well. When is your new book coming out?
Oh, Blue Coat are suggesting it'll come out in late summer. So I guess August, September, I think. Might be a bit sooner.
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll try and set up some sort of recording so we can go through Home Street and work at some point. And that might be interesting. Let's look at that in the summer. But until then, it's been wonderful. Thank you. I wish you well.
Very best wishes to you and to all your audience. Thank you.